You started dating, he's Catholic, he loves his mom, he talks about marriage seriously, you pray together, you start imagining what your kids might look like. You picture a small house, Sunday dinners, a shared last name. You start discerning, your brain begins to build a future, and then he breaks up with you, or you break up with him, and suddenly all of that imagined future evaporates. The wedding song in your head stops, but your body doesn't, because while the relationship ended in a conversation, the attachment didn't end in a conversation. Romantic attachment changes your neurobiology. It wires anticipation into your dopamine system. It integrates someone into your stress regulation. It builds a narrative of expectation. So when it ends, you're not just sad. Your nervous system is recalibrating after losing a regulator. And if you don't understand that, you can start misinterpreting your distress as weakness or immaturity or spiritual failure. Today, I want to show you what's actually happening in your brain after a breakup and how to help your body reorganize in a way that allows you to heal, not just eventually, but more completely. Body, mind, and soul. Okay, so splash some water on your face, throw those used tissues in the trash, put your hair in a messy bun, and let's go. When love ends, many people immediately move to emotional language. We say things like, I'm heartbroken, or I'm grieving, or I just miss him or her. And all of that's true, but underneath those words, something far more precise is happening. Your nervous system is actually recalibrating after losing a primary attachment figure. And unless we understand that layer, unless we understand what's happening neurologically, we can easily misinterpret our own experience. We can assume that we're regressing, or that we're overreacting, or that our distress means something about our maturity or our faith. Instead, I want to give you something steadier than reassurance. I'd like to give you some clarity. When you understand the biology of heartbreak, healing becomes less mysterious and far more intentional. This is the podcast that I wish I had had during some of my most difficult breakups. Romantic attachment is not simply emotional closeness. It's also a neurochemical bond. Theology of the body, my friends. When you begin dating someone seriously, especially if you're dating with discernment in mind, your brain begins to associate that person with safety, anticipation, and reward. Dopamine increases around future planning. Oxytocin supports bonding and trust. Cortisol lowers when you feel secure in their presence. Over time, your nervous system integrates that person into its own regulation system. They become someone you instinctively reach towards when you're stressed or uncertain. Their voice, their predictability, their patterns, they become cues of stability. So when the relationship ends, the dopamine drops dramatically. Cortisol rises, and your attachment system, it activates what we call a protest. And that protest can feel like urgency, rumination, anxiety, longing, even a kind of agitation that seems disproportionate to the situation. It can feel like withdrawal. And from the outside, it may look like you're overthinking, but on the inside, it feels like something is missing that your body was relying on. And this is a real neurological withdrawal. And this happens even if you are the one doing the breaking up. Understanding these changes is the entire conversation shift. Why it hurts so deeply. So there's research showing that social rejection activates regions of the brain associated with physical pain process. So in other words, relational loss is actually encoded in overlapping circuitry with bodily pain. It physically hurts. Beyond that, there's something even more destabilizing that happens. When you were in that relationship, your brain was constructing a future narrative. It was anticipating shared holidays, conversations, milestones, and even daily routine. Dopamine thrives on anticipated reward, on what's coming next. That's why it's not just the pleasure neurochemical, it's the just one more. When a breakup occurs, that anticipated future, it collapses abruptly. The brain experiences prediction error. What it thought was going to happen is no longer happening. And that collapse is not just emotional disappointment. It is complete neurological disorientation. So for Catholics, there is actually an additional layer that intensifies this rupture. Dating is not typically framed as casual exploration for Catholics. It's framed as discernment of a vocation. So when the relationship ends, it can feel as though not only a person is being lost, but also a possible calling, our primary meaning in life. And that weight can make the grief feel existential rather than merely relational, which is why minimizing this pain rarely works. Attachment, protest, and withdrawal. Attachment bonds break, the nervous system moves into what we call a protest mode before it moves to acceptance. Protest can look like persistent rumination, an urge to reach out, revisiting text messages, replaying conversations, or mentally negotiating alternate outcomes. Was it because I said this? What if I had done this? Would this have made a difference? Your brain is attempting to restore connection because connection previously signaled safety and reward. This stage can feel frantic and all-consuming. And friends, I have been there. It can also be prolonged unintentionally when contact remains inconsistent, which means occasional reassurance, sporadic communication, checking in on their social media, Facebook, stalking, even through a friend. These intermittent reinforcements actually strengthen the attachment circuitry, making it harder for the nervous system to recalibrate to your new normal. This is why containment becomes so important early on. If you're not sure if the relationship is, as I say to my clients, done, then by all means, let's keep working. But if you are done, then stopping all connection can be very important for a period of time. This is not as punishment or emotional suppression, but this done, no contact is neurological stabilization. Every exposure that spikes hope and then collapses reactivates your stress response. So without understanding that, people often believe that they're simply too attached or too emotional, or why is this lasting so long? When in reality, the nervous system has not yet been given consistent conditions to reorganize. So when your bestie says, just block them, listen to her. It will help. Why understanding the neurobiology changes how you heal. If we approach heartbreak purely emotionally, we often rely on time alone to heal it. But when we understand neurobiology, we can intervene in ways that support this recalibration. We can stabilize dopamine rather than unconsciously feeding those craving loops. And yes, when a relationship breaks after a breakup, we actually crave that person. We can regulate cortisol rather than spiritualizing our anxiety, and we can structure rumination rather than drowning in it. What we can also do is support circadian rhythm to support mood stabilization. And by the way, Dr. Andrew Huberman has some fantastic information on this, albeit not in a Catholic context. Healing faster doesn't mean rushing this grief. It actually means reducing unnecessary prolongation of this dysregulation. When the nervous system stabilizes, then clarity can return. And when that returns, then meaning making becomes grounding rather than reactive. And then when that happens, you're far less likely to draw catastrophic conclusions about your worth, your discernment, or your future vocation. This is why I'm approaching this from a neurobiological lens. This isn't to reduce heartbreak to chemicals, not at all, but to give you this extra piece of the puzzle that I certainly wish I had had when I was in college. I want to give you tools that allow grief to move through you without embedding itself unnecessarily. Dopamine withdrawal. Why you keep thinking about him or her? One of the most confusing parts of breakup is how persistent the thoughts can feel. You may wake up thinking about him or her before you even consciously choose to. You may find yourself replaying conversations about driving, folding laundry, or trying to pray. You may tell yourself that you're done analyzing it, and then you notice that your mind is back there again in the what ifs. This is where understanding dopamine becomes incredibly helpful. Dopamine is not just the pleasure chemical, it is the neurochemical of pursuit and anticipation. It fuels motivation, it reinforces what the brain believes is valuable and important. When you were in a relationship, especially one that felt hopeful, your brain was regularly anticipating connection. The next date, the next message, the next shared moment, the next future together. But when that relationship ends, dopamine abruptly drops. And the brain, wired for survival and reward, attempts to restore the lost signal. And that attempt can feel like craving. It can feel like mental fixation or longing that intensifies rather than softens. And if you interpret that fixation as emotional weakness, you're likely fighting it. If you interpret that fixation as proof you should be together, then you may misunderstand it. If you understand it as dopamine withdrawal, then you can approach it differently. The goal is not to suppress the thought or the feeling. The goal is to stabilize this baseline dopamine so that your brain is no longer constantly searching for the lost stimulus, which is the other person, the relationship, the future together. And this is a very different strategy than a chick flick and a pint of your best Bluebell, although everyone deserves one of those nights or two. The no contact principle and neurological containment. One of the most predictive early interpretations after breakup, and when I say predictive, do you know that psychologists actually study breakups? What helps, what hurts, in all the different aspects? Can you imagine working in a breakup lab? Anyways, I digress. One of the most predictive early interventions about breakup is contained exposure. Detachment is not about being cold, or cutting contact is not meant to be dramatic. Intermittent reinforcement strengthens these attachment circuits. So every time you check social media or reread a message or have a brief exchange that reignites hope, your brain receives a small dopamine spike, but usually that's followed by a drop. And that spike drop cycle deepens craving pathways, and it actually prolongs recalibration. When I say recalibration, I'm talking about getting used to the new normal. When you create a defined period of no contact, including digital contact, you give your nervous system consistent conditions in which to stabilize, and this consistency is regulating. Without it, the attachment system remains particularly activated, waiting for the next signal. So this is not about pushing yourself, it's about protecting your nervous system from ongoing volatility. And for many people, this one structured boundary alone shortens the intensity of the protest phase significantly. And yes, we do have data on that. Cortisol, sleep, and the body's response system. Alongside dopamine withdrawal, breakups activate the stress system. Cortisol increases, your body shifts into subtle vigilance, sleep can become lighter, more fragmented, your appetite may fluctuate, and your energy can feel erratic. Maybe you're wired at night, but exhausted in the afternoon. And this is not random. When the nervous system perceives relational instability, it interprets that as a threat, because remember, we are relational beings. Everything from our biology to our spirituality tells us that. The attachment bond previously signaled safety, but its absence requires this recalibration, which means healing must be physiological regulation, not just emotional. And this is where rhythm becomes particularly powerful. Morning sunlight exposure within the first hour of waking helps create an anchor for your circadian rhythm. Gentle movement, a 10-minute walk with your bestie supports dopamine stabilization. Eating protein early in the morning, if it's safe for you to do so, can also reduce emotional volatility by stabilizing your blood sugar and neurotransmitter production. These interventions may sound simple, but they really are foundational. When sleep stabilizes and cortisol lowers, emotional intensity becomes more workable. We can manage these feelings better. Meaning making becomes clearer and prayer becomes less foggy. Healing from a breakup is not just emotional and spiritual, it is embodied. This is theology of the body of breakups, if you will. Structured rumination, containing the mental loop. Rumination, one of my brain's favorites, is often interpreted as emotional maturity or obsession, or sometimes it can also be misinterpreted as a belief that the relationship should happen. In reality, rumination is the brain attempting to solve a problem that feels unresolved. And after a breakup, the mind tends to reconstruct causality. What happened? What did I miss? What if I could have done something different? Our brain wants a coherent narrative. The problem is we often don't have all the pieces of the puzzle. So part of this is understanding that there may be parts of your breakup that you never completely understand. And instead of filling out those pieces that we don't have, we have to have some acceptance around knowing there may be pieces that we never fully understand. One of the most effective tools here is structured reflection time. Rather than attempting to stop these thoughts altogether, you could designate a containment period, maybe 20 or 30 minutes, where you intentionally reflect or journal or process. And then outside of that time, when these thoughts arise, you just note them down and gently defer them to your window. I will see you guys at 6 when it's time to think about it. This practice teaches the nervous system that processing will happen, but not continuously. And over time, that urgency decreases because the brain no longer fears that the issue will go unexamined if it's not dealt with immediately. So this containment reduces intensity without suppressing grief, which is why it's one of my more favorite strategies for dealing with rumination. Rebuilding identity and narrative coherence. Beyond the chemistry, there is also a narrative collapse. Our brains are meaning-making, story-making machines. When you're in a relationship, especially when oriented towards your vocation, your self-concept starts to shift. You begin imagining yourself as someone's wife or husband. You envision a shared home. You incorporate that person into your future plans. And when that ends, the story dissolves. The nervous system recalibrates biologically, but the psyche must recalibrate narratively. This is where deliberate narrative reconstruction becomes very healing. I'll tell you what it means. Writing the story from beginning to end, not just the good moments, but the red flags, the tensions, the patterns. This allows the brain to integrate that experience rather than idealize it. Clarity softens that longing. When you see the relationship as it truly was, including the misalignment or the immaturity, the attachment systems gradually release its grip because the fantasy loses coherence. That doesn't eliminate the grief, but it does help to ground it. And from that grounded place, growth and a future and healing becomes possible. Attachment patterns revealed in breakup. One of the unexpected gifts of a breakup, even though it rarely feels like a gift in the moment, is that it exposes your attachment patterns with remarkable clarity. When everything is stable, we can function reasonably well. But when connection feels threatened, our underlying strategies surface very quickly. People become hyper attuned, scanning for signs of distance, working harder to repair, over-functioning emotionally. Some people may withdraw or minimize their needs or convince themselves that they're fine while disconnecting internally. And then some people oscillate between protest and avoidance. Breakups often amplify these tendencies. So rather than interpreting your reactions as embarrassing or excessive, this is actually a moment to observe them with curiosity and compassion. How did you respond when you sensed distance? Did you silence yourself? Did you pursue reassurance incessantly? Did you feel insecure or fear abandonment? Did you detach prematurely? And this is not about self-criticism, it's about increasing. Secure attachment is not built by pretending that distress does not exist. It's built by recognizing how we regulate under stress and then gradually strengthening our capacity to remain grounded without collapsing or chasing. Breakups, while painful, often illuminate precisely where growth is needed for future covenantal love. Regulating the nervous system in acute distress. There are moments after breakup when emotions feel acutely intense. When your chest tightens, your thoughts accelerate, your body feels restless, and in those moments, reasoning rarely helps. But helping your physiology often does. One of the most effective tools for this acute downregulation is called the physiological sigh. A slow inhale through the nose, followed by a brief second inhale to fully expand the lungs, and then a very long extended exhale. So in, out. Repeating this cycle several times sends a direct signal to our autonomic nervous system that the threat is decreasing. It's a nervous system hack, if you will. Also, cold exposure can be very powerful for some people. Brief cold water exposure can increase dopamine gradually over time and strengthen stress reliance. But if you do this, you want to learn more about it. It can be unsafe in certain situations, so do it carefully. We're not trying to hurt yourself. You could also just use cold paper towels and put them on your cheeks, and that can also help. Consistent resistant training or moderate cardio several times a week that is safe for you to do so increases BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Now, this BDNF is essentially the fertilizer that helps our brain grow new pathways. It's absolutely amazing. Essentially supporting our neural repair and increasing your resilience. And strength training and moderate cardio can help. There's many other things as well. So you could Google ways to increase BDNF, and you can probably find all kinds of things and see what works for you. None of these, though, are about erasing the grief. They reduce the volatility of the grief. But when that volatility decreases, emotional processing becomes more integrated rather than chaotic. Remember that healing requires both emotional work and physiological regulation. Again, theology of the body. When faith and nervous system get confused. For Catholics especially, there's often an added of confusion after a breakup. You may begin with asking spiritual questions from a dysregulated state. Did I misdiscern? Did I miss God's will? Was I naive? Is this a punishment? Is this redirection? Am I really called to marriage? When the nervous system is regulated, the mind will seek clarity. And sometimes theology becomes a place where we try to resolve anxiety, but discernment made under stress is rarely accurate, and the saints have told us this again and again. Before drawing spiraling spiritual conclusions about your existential meaning in this world, the nervous system needs stability, which means you don't need to figure out the rest of your life tonight. Give yourself a good 30 days to recalibrate. When cortisol lowers and dopamine stabilizes, your perception will become clearer. What initially may have felt catastrophic may later appear misalignment, and what felt like failure may reveal itself simply as incompatibility. God's providence operates through freedom, growth, and maturity. It's not fragile, and it's not undone by one relationship ending. Translation, He's still got you. Vocation unfolds over time. It's clarified by growth, not guaranteed by intensity. And sometimes what feels like rupture and collapse of all of our life goals, we look back and see is actually important refinement. This is a very highfalutin way of saying maybe you dodged a bullet. Suffering is formation, not identity. It's important to approach this very carefully. Breakups are not trivial, they can be deeply painful, and they deserve respect and processing. At the same time, suffering can serve as formation, but it's important not to make it our identity. When attachment ruptures, it reveals fears that are already present: the fear of being alone, of inadequacy, the fear of abandonment. The breakup didn't create those fears, it's just exposing them. Exposure is uncomfortable, but again, it can be clarifying. It can give you information about yourself if you approach it with curiosity and compassion. Formation happens when we allow that exposure to strengthen regulation, to deepen our self awareness, and to increase our emotional maturity. Marriage as a sacrament requires secure attachment, emotion regulation, conflict repair skills, stable identity, as well as all of the Catholic checkboxes that we usually look for. Growth in these other areas often happens through relational disappointment rather than ease. So the question may shift from, why did this happen, to, what is this revealing in me that will strengthen my future covenant? And that shift can help reduce the helpless feelings and help restore feelings of agency, reorienting towards the future. Eventually, healing requires future reorientation. Now, this is not forced optimism or toxic positivity. This is not about premature dating or distracting. This is a gradual reorientation. One practical exercise involves imagining yourself 12 months from now, not in a fantasy land, but in a way that's integrated. Imagine yourself regulated, grounded, able to remember this chapter without destabilization. Imagine yourself capable of secure love, whether that leads to marriage or continued discernment. Another thing we know that can increase dopamine is this idea of the new start, which is why we get a little boost at the beginning of Lent, or at the beginning of a 100-day project, or at the beginning of a new year. So if you think of this day as day one and start beginning to think of what a new future might look like, or projects that you may want to take on, skills you want to develop, a craft idea that you want to explore that you never did before, these can all be ways of helping yourself restore dopamine in a healthy way. When to seek additional support. The first few days after a breakup can be very disorienting. Sometimes people can't go to work or school, but there's a big difference between grief and complete destabilization. Grief fluctuates. It moves in waves, it softens gradually, even if unpredictably. Destabilization lingers without relief. This is where the panic persists, sleep remains severely disturbed, intrusive thoughts dominate your daily functioning. You may find yourself not able to work or concentrate, or feel pulled towards compulsive contact behaviors that you cannot regulate over an extended period of time. There's no virtue in white knuckling a nervous system dysregulation that's extended like this. Therapy can accelerate healing, not because you're incapable of doing it yourself, but because co-regulation matters, and these skills may need teaching. Secure attachment is rebuilt in safe relational spaces, and sometimes that space is a wise friend or a trusted spiritual director. Sometimes it's in therapy. If abandonment trauma from early life stages has been activated, professional support can prevent this breakup from reinforcing old attachment injuries. Healing faster does not mean that you have to do it alone. What healing actually looks like. Healing after a breakup, it's subtle. It's putting one step in front of the other, doing the next right thing after the next right thing after the next right thing. It's gradually waking up, getting into the sunshine, resetting those patterns, starting new projects, developing new interest. Little by little, you notice that you can go several hours without thinking about it, or that your sleep starts to get better, or you can imagine a future without this immediate tightness and sadness in your chest. And those memories of the relationship can start feeling less emotionally charged. There's not a sudden switch. The nervous system gradually recalibrates, dopamine gradually stabilizes, cortisol gradually lowers, narrative coherence strengthens, and the attachment protests soften. However, if we understand that these are all the components that relate to the distress of a breakup, then we can think about ways to healthfully put in other means of dopamine, like doing hard things, like starting new projects, like being together with friends, or decreasing cortisol, like being together with supportive people or engaging in activities that help lower your stress. The narrative coherence can be helped by a relationship audit or learning to rewrite this story in a new way. You'll begin to remember the relationship more realistically, not through an idealization or through self-blame, through integration. Also remember that healing doesn't erase love. It just reorganizes it in a way that's more accurate and healthy. Vocation and freedom. So if you're still here, you're probably Catholic, and I want to speak directly to this vocational layer. When a relationship ends, it can feel as though you've lost your path, your existential path, as though your discernment has failed or you've missed something that is irreversible. But remember that vocation is not a fragile thread that snaps with one decision. God's providence works through freedom, growth, and time. Discernment clarifies your capacity, and sometimes relationships end precisely because the clarity needed for lifetime covenant has emerged and found wanting. Marriage is not simply about intense emotion. It requires secure attachment, the stable regulation that we talk about, mutual maturity, and an aligned vision. A breakup that reveals any level of misalignment in any of these areas, even though you may still be spiritually aligned, which means still believe in the Catholic view of marriage or natural family planning, remember that that is not enough. These other areas have to be aligned, and a breakup may reveal this and prevent deep suffering later. And of course, this doesn't make it less painful, but it does help reframe it and give it meaning. We know that when we have meaning, we can carry this suffering or sadness better. Vocation is often quieter and less flashy than what we think of as romance, but it is real and it is true, and you will discover it with the help of God, with the important people in your life, with healthy relationships, and by taking that next right step, which might look like just studying for your chemistry final and getting to bed early tonight, becoming more secure than before. If you approach this season after a breakup intentionally, something very important can happen. You can emerge more securely attached than you were before the relationship began. You can learn how your nervous system responds under stress. You can strengthen your ability to regulate without excessive external reassurance. You can clarify things that you've ignored, what you tolerated, that you shouldn't, what you need and didn't have. Sometimes it's just as important to know what you don't need or don't want in a spouse as to know what you do. You can become someone who chooses from a place of stability rather than urgency. That is to say, from a place of freedom, not fear. And this is growth. That growth changes the quality of future love and allows you to have a sacramental marriage if that is God's plan. Because remember, we have to marry from a place of freedom for our sacrament to be valid. When a relationship ends, the pain can feel deeply personal, and it is. You shared yourself, you hoped, you imagined a future. Something meaningful was built and something meaningful was dissolved. At the same time, What you're experiencing is not just that emotional chaos, it's also a nervous system recalibrating. It's an attachment bond that's reorganizing, and it's a narrative that needs to be rewritten. Understanding that does not diminish the emotional weight or the sacredness of love and vocation. It just allows you to move through it with intention instead of confusion and urgency. Healing in this season is not about convincing yourself that this relationship didn't matter. It's about allowing your body to stabilize, your mind to integrate this story accuracy, and your heart to mature rather than harden. This is a time and a space for grief, reflection, and ultimately growth. And there's also space for hope, not rushed or forced, but steady and grounded in the truth that vocation unfolds through freedom and formation over time. And that our God who began a work with you is faithful to its completion. Whether this breakup feels like the worst decision you've ever made, or the one you wish you could undo, or the one you knew was necessary, but are still aching over, remember, there is room here for you. No matter how long it takes you to recalibrate, even if you're still in the middle of it, there's always room for you on the Catholic couch. Don't forget to send this episode to someone who needs it. And when you're ready, remember, we have lots of videos on Catholic dating. I'll put a few of them right here.